It's important to say that the modern era of science started about 300 years ago, and it started as an open enterprise. It started by people who had corresponded in private, deciding to make their correspondence public, publishing it, and it was published by the great learned societies of the time, with the Royal Society in London probably taking the lead. And many historians of science believe that the scientific revolutions of the 18th and 19th centuries, which expanded our knowledge of the world extraordinarily, arose largely because of the open communication of science. And it's important to say two things. Firstly, that the criterion for openness by the early editors of those early journals that were so influential were that not only should you publish the concept, the idea that you had, but you must publish the evidence, that is the data, in the same article in the journal. It's crucial to the progress of science, and crucial largely because it permitted others to scrutinize the idea, look at the evidence for the idea, ask the question, is there a logical connection? And of course it also permitted them, if sufficient details were given of how they'd worked, what experiments they'd made, what observations they'd made, to try to replicate either the observations or the experiment. So open science is not new. That's how science in the modern era started. What is crucial, however, is that we have to reinvent open science because something really dramatic has happened over the last 20 to 30 years. And that is that we have quite novel ways of acquiring information, evidence, data, powerful, often electronic means of doing so, which give us vast quantities of data which you never had access to before. And of course we have means both of manipulating that data in modern computers, of storing that data, and also, of course, instantaneously transmitting both the data and the ideas. And the key question is, what does modern open science look like in the modern era? Because there's absolutely no question that the ability of science to be, as it has become, the most reliable means of acquiring knowledge does depend upon openness. Well, if we look at the material progress of human society from its very beginnings, I think there is very little doubt that that progress has depended on expanding our knowledge of the world. So in an absolutely fundamental sense, that scientific knowledge, this robust, much more reliable means of acquiring knowledge about the world we live in and about ourselves, is a fundamental global public good. In other words, in principle, everyone benefits. But of course, we're in Greece, and if we hark back to the Greek myths, you must remember Pandora, so that when she opened her box and knowledge came out, it was knowledge of good and it was knowledge of evil. So in a sense, all this knowledge that we acquire can be used both for good and for evil. And the whole point of collecting together in governed states where we give our democratic voice to those who don't rule us, but in a sense represent us, is that we expect them to use the knowledge that we gain through science and other means as a means of good and not of evil. Would that it were so. Well, I think, first of all, it's important to understand what has changed, why we need to reinvent open science. And the answer is very simple, that we have this enormous amount of data, and that whereas 30, 40 years ago, if I published a paper in a journal, I could put all the data that I'd collected in that journal. Now that's no longer possible. There's simply too much of it. And in a sense, what's happened is because of that difficulty, we have lost what used to be a rule of scientific life of publishing the data as well as the concept. And now we publish the concept, but we tend not to publish the data. And you could say that whereas the concept is like an advertisement for the science, the real science lies in the data. And so we've got to get back to the idea of publishing concurrently the data with the concept. And of course, you can't put it in the journal, but there are many databases into which you can locate your data which are publicly accessible. If I then go on to really answer your question, several things are needed. Firstly, by scientists, we have got to get used to the idea that this is not our data. Our fellow citizens as taxpayers ultimately have paid for us to do that. We're merely custodians of the data on their behalf. Secondly, the institutions which employ us have got to take responsibility for the knowledge that we, on their behalf, create. And that actually means publishing the data and the concept and ensuring that it's done. And also those that fund science have got to say, if we fund the science you do, you must ensure that your data is open. And those that publish science, the publishers, they've got to say, we won't publish your paper unless you can show us that the data will be made concurrently available in some accessible database. So that's where the responsibilities lie. Well, it's a difficult question. In a sense, it's a rather fundamental question that's been asked through the ages. But let's take two examples of it. One of it is when we develop new technologies based on science, which are able to do things in different ways, new ways. If we go back to the Industrial Revolution, when we found means of production which were more lucrative, brought more money in, but required more labor, and people came from the fields into those industries, then of course what happened was existing industrial patterns of behavior changed completely, and old-fashioned skills no longer had any place. We go back even further to when Gutenberg invented the printing press, which suddenly made the business model of the medieval monastery redundant. And so there's a real social problem of how do you make change based on new ideas so that it is not very damaging to sectors of society whose work is embedded in old ways of doing things. So there's nothing new there. It's an old problem which has to be solved by political means. There is, of course, another issue that relates to this problem of Pandora and her box, and that's what's called dual use of new knowledge, whereby you can very clearly use that knowledge to benefit or for damage. For example, 2 years ago, papers were submitted to two distinguished journals, one in the UK, one in America, which described how bird flu might jump the species barrier to the human species. And of course, bird-derived influenza is very damaging to humans simply because we have no defenses against it. So they did these experiments which showed the conditions under which this might best happen. And the US authorities then said, please don't publish this, because if this went into the hands of terrorists with a malign intent, it could be very damaging. But then an interesting discussion took place between scientists and civil servants and politicians. And at the end of the day, one of the most powerful arguments for publishing this is that nature is a more powerful terrorist than humans. That nature is all the time looking for ways for a virus to jump the species barrier, and she is more likely to be successful and more likely to have a widespread damaging impact than a couple of foolish young men in the back streets of some country somewhere. And it's better to have the evidence in the hands of public health authorities, so if something were to happen, either natural or human-induced, they would have the means of combating it. And so this whole problem of the use of new knowledge for good or ill is a complicated one, but it's one we've had a lot of experience of in the past. Of course, one thing you could say is, let us not find out anything new. Let us stay where we were. Well, firstly, the human animal will never permit it. It just won't happen. And secondly, wouldn't it be sad if we condemned ourselves simply to think as our antecedents had? Well, I think there are 2 or 3 reasons for communicating science. One is that it's fun and it's exciting. Trying to understand the way in which flowers and plants grow and live and evolve and develop, or how the oceans work, or the movements of the planets. It's exciting, it's natural, and humans are naturally inquisitive about these things. But I think there's also a much more fundamental view, and that is that science is, and science will continue to change the world we live in. And in a democratic society, then we shouldn't wish to have things change without our having a say in it as members of that society. Now, science is very difficult. It needs a lot of application, a lot of thought, a lot of careful work. And if we're going to put into the hands of individual citizens the means to influence decisions that our politicians or the companies might make, then they need to understand science rather better. But I think part of the challenge to scientists is that we need to identify those areas which are of public concern. And if you ask, well, how do we know that? Then I think you just look into the columns of the newspapers to find out those areas which are of public concern. And we should be taking really important steps in trying to give to our fellow citizens not just the concepts, but the evidence that underlies them. And the reason I say that is because, particularly in recent years, there are many individuals, many citizens, who have no longer been satisfied, and quite rightly not satisfied, to listen simply to a scientist saying, well, this is this and that is that, just accept my word for it. What they want to see is the evidence that underlies that, so they can convince themselves that that's the correct thing to do, because of course many of these developments have important implications both for individuals and for the societies of which they're part. One sees it most clearly in areas of disease and major medical problems, where people do want to know about the evidence of the potential impact of a disease on them, their families and their relations, and the ways in which they might well be able to avoid them. So there's an important dialogue that needs to take place between science and society. And as I say, it's no longer sufficient to act as if one were Pope, to say, this is how things are. Our fellow citizens are intelligent, they're increasingly well educated, and we need to convey to them the evidence so they can then make their own minds up whether they believe this or not. I think the main difficulty in communicating science to the general public is imagination or lack of it. If you have become, I've worked in a particular field of science for many years now. For me, many of the ideas to which my neighbor might think are rather strange and rather peculiar, for me, they're everyday ideas, and I can talk to them and think about them quite easily. But if I talk to my neighbor about them, then I use long words, new words, strange concepts, and I have to think in his terms. I have to think, well, how do I explain to someone who has no background in this domain what I think is happening there? And the next step, of course, is how can I provide him with the evidence so that ultimately he or she could make their own mind up? And that's not easy. If, for example, you were to say, the stance the European Commission has taken over open data recently is both laudable and it's naive. It's laudable because our fellow citizens have paid for this science. It's naive, because if you expected scientists to make their data and their evidence intelligently open to their fellow citizens, science would stop tomorrow. We'd all be busy providing background data, metadata, that is data about data, for our fellow citizens. In reality, of course, our fellow citizens don't want to know about the details of my work on the Antarctic ice sheet. What they want to know about is sea level rise, or climate change, or infectious disease, or water supply. And so we ought to be focusing our efforts in communicating to our fellow citizens in those areas that they care about. In other words, to a large degree, they should be defining the agenda, and we respond to the agenda that they set.